Welcome back. When we last left off, I had just brought up terminal velocity, the theoretical maximum speed a falling object can reach due to air resistance working against gravitational acceleration. In most games, there either is not terminal velocity, or you reach it very quickly, much faster than you approach it in real life. Before going into this wonderful world of air resistance and how it affects acceleration, let's get back to Portal. You see, in part 1, I was wrong about my assumptions for why Portal's gravity seemed so low. I assumed air resistance was the culprit, but it is not. The real reason ends up looking a lot like air resistance, which is likely why it was programmed into the game. It turns out there is no air resistance at all in Portal. It's just that whenever you enter a portal above a certain velocity, your velocity exiting the portal is reset at that velocity. Let me show you. Using console commands, you can see your velocity for each frame, displayed in Source Engine's hammer unit of distance, which is equal to 0.01905 meters. As I fall, my velocity keeps increasing, but then, entering the portal, it gets pushed back to 1,000 units, or 19.05 meters per second. This effectively creates a soft terminal velocity. This is pretty ingenious, as Portal really gets the best of both worlds here. It gets the simplicity of having its gravity simply governed by constant acceleration without messing with air resistance, while at the same time, for falls high enough where air resistance would matter, these heights only being achievable using portals, there is a limit to how fast you can fall, which eliminates the overly unrealistic side effect of no air resistance. Basically falling for so long that your velocity becomes ridiculous and could start messing with rendering and collision in the game world. But how can I be certain there is no air resistance? First of all, I should say that whether a game has air resistance, or it directly decreases the value for the acceleration due to gravity, the results are indistinguishable. So, when I say a game has or does not have air resistance, that is the same thing as saying its gravity changes depending on how long you fall. In Portal, I tested for the presence of air resistance by finding a really high fall and comparing my final velocity to the expected velocity, assuming there is no air resistance. For 3 different falls from around 80 meters up, my experimental maximum velocity was incredibly close to the expected final velocity when g is assumed constant. These values fall well within the margin of error. So unless air resistance is just super weak in Portal, it probably does not exist. G is indeed constant. But what is the value for g? Since it obviously isn't that absurdly low number I derived in part 1. It seems to be around 11.4 meters per second squared, which happens to be right around 600 hammer units. Since we know games like Modern Warfare 2019 and Assassin's Creed 2 do not have constant gravitational acceleration, they will not be as easy to explain as Portal. What's interesting about them is just how quickly you reach terminal velocity compared to the real world. Well, technically in the real world, you never truly reach your terminal velocity. You only asymptotically approach it. In the case of a typical skydiver, after 3 seconds, they will be at 47.4% of terminal velocity. After 8 seconds, 87.9%. After 15 seconds, 98.8%. What this basically means is that a free-falling object does not indefinitely positively accelerate towards the ground forever. Eventually, it'll basically stop accelerating and fall at a constant speed. A change in acceleration over time is called a jerk. This is a real-life graph of the acceleration of a falling object during a fall. Air getting in the way of the object as the object falls causes the acceleration of the object to jerk until it's basically zero. At the beginning of a fall, jerk is very little and is increasing. Then it begins decreasing and approaches zero. A change in jerk over time is called a jounce, or also a snap. It might seem right now that jerk and jounce are superfluous information which I added into the video to seem smarter than I really am, but it will come in handy when I try to explain the changing gravity and/or air resistance of a game I tested. But all that's just to say that freefall air resistance in the real world is a bit complicated. When I found the value for G in the games I tested for part 1, I used an equation which assumes no air resistance. So, I calculated what the acceleration due to gravity would be if air resistance was completely realistic in these games. I'll only show some of the values because the change is rather small. This ends up making G bigger than before, and the change is related to how far the drop was. The bigger the drop, the more air resistance matters. As for the other factors that affect air resistance besides the velocity of the falling object, like cross-sectional area of the object, the density of the air, the mass of the object, I of course don't know all of these things. I had to assume them. Here are the masses I used, which are based on either the lore of the game or real-world averages. But for estimating a K value, it's not that simple. The one value that's most important to get besides object mass is the air resistance constant, denoted with K, which has the unit kilograms per meter. K takes in the inputs density of the air, cross-sectional area of the falling object, and the drag coefficient of the object. I decided to be generous and give a high K value for a vertically oriented falling person, since, after all, high air resistance is my leading theory for the G values varying so much depending on height. I won't bore you with the details, but I arrived at K equals 0.077 as a very generous value. The value for a belly-to-earth skydiver is K equals 0.24, but unfortunately, these guys were falling in a standing position, so it is much lower. As you probably noticed, even the falls from the highest distance did not have their G values change very much. So, it is clear that a realistic amount of air resistance won't cut it. Let's focus on just Modern Warfare 2019 for a second, and bump K up to 2.6, and assume G is a constant 32 meters per second squared. For each height, we can calculate the expected time to fall, given G equals 32 meters per second squared, K equals 2.6 kilograms per meter, and mass equals 82 kilograms. And then from that time, calculate the G value, assuming no air resistance. Then we can compare that G value to the experimental G value from inside the game. It sounds like a lot of work, but it's really not that bad. Here are all the new G values and percent differences from the experimental values. I could have gone in and adjusted mass, gravity, and K until I found something that matches better, but I know making this video is kind of a waste of my precious time before I one day die, but doing that sounds like a whole nother level of time wastery, especially when you consider that the experimental G values already have error associated with them. At the very least, the huge drop in G values is present, going from 30.9 to 19.6 meters per second squared. So something like this is probably what's happening in the game. There's a really high amount of acceleration due to gravity for lower falls, and when you are higher up, the massive amount of air resistance begins to kick in. How much air resistance exactly, though? Let's take a look at that K equals 2.6 figure I used. There are a few ways to achieve an air resistance constant this big. Here are 4 ways, 3 of them where 2 variables are held at a realistic value and the other one is an extreme number, and 1 where each of the 3 variables is increased by a lesser amount. As you can see, the kind of slowdown you experience due to air resistance in Modern Warfare, if it is indeed caused by high air resistance, is super unrealistic, leading to the hilarious possibility of the air having a density rivaling that of almighty balsa wood, or your falling character taking up an area almost the size of a standard parking spot. Okay, so we get it. Initial gravitational acceleration is super high, and the slowdown, whether it's actually from air resistance or not, is way faster than real life. That's about as far as we can go with Modern Warfare 2019. In order to gain more insight into exactly what is going on, I needed as accurate of a set of measurements as I could get. And what better game for that than Minecraft? Now I know what you're thinking. Hey, Minecraft doesn't take place on Earth. It takes place on a giant square with a maximum thickness of 256 blocks. You can't expect it to have realistic gravity. Well, yes, I agree with you, fictional viewer. But surprisingly enough, Minecraft's gravity seems to behave in a similar way as most of the other realistic games I measured. But Minecraft has the added benefit of allowing precise measurements because each block is exactly 1 meter tall. After falling from a bunch of different heights, I plotted fall height and G to see exactly what is going on. As you can see, it's bizarre. So what are we looking at here? I'm not totally sure, but I'll give it my best shot. First, consider what the y-axis actually represents. It is showing the value of G calculated with this equation. Therefore, it is not a direct value for the acceleration at a given height. It more shows how the acceleration changes from the previously measured height up to the height that was measured. So the dot at 35 meters showing G equals 22.86 does not mean the acceleration at 35 meters is 22.86. It just means that for the distance between 30 and 35, acceleration increased compared to lower down, making the total height's G value be 22.86. Okay, the tangential slope of the curve is related to the value of the jerk. A lower slope means acceleration is decreasing at a slower pace. A negative slope means jerk is negative, acceleration is decreasing, and vice versa. The more curvature, the faster the change of jerk. That is, jounce is greater. When the curve is flatter, jounce is less. The error bars for the lower values are a bit big, but for now, let's be naughty and ignore them. For the first 4 meters or so, jerk is minimal. Then there's a very strong jounce, as the jerk of acceleration picks up dramatically. Acceleration dives down to a relatively low level, but it starts to increase for some reason at around 20 meters. This is incredibly strange and totally goes against normal laws of physics. There should be no positive slope on this graph. Here's what this graph looks like using real-world values for a belly-to-earth skydiver. And here's what it would look like if that skydiver fell and G was equal to 30 meters per second squared. Minecraft is weird. But alas, there is a positive slope. We'll just have to deal with it. Acceleration stops increasing, and there's a very sudden change of jerk. Then, jounce goes to near zero, as the jerk of acceleration seems to hold a constant value. However, if we zoom out, you can see that this only appears flat because it is so far zoomed in. To know whether or not there is still jerk, we need to know if terminal velocity is a thing in Minecraft. If it is, then jerk and acceleration will reach zero when we reach terminal velocity, and the curve is just due to how the value for G is calculated. The higher you go, the closer to realistic Minecraft gets, which would imply a terminal velocity. To find out definitively, I simply counted the time it took for me to land once I passed block 255 for the falls from over 255 meters. If the times are the same, then we know velocity is the same, which is what terminal velocity is. For each fall, here's the time to fall the last 255 meters. It seems that at around 1,000 meters, terminal velocity is reached completely. So, good. Minecraft does have terminal velocity. Before I explain why I think the lower fall G values are so weird, I bet you're wondering how I managed to measure a height in Minecraft of over 7,000 meters. If you don't really care, you can skip to here, but I think it's interesting, and it might make you more skeptical of my results if you know how I got them. And a good dose of skepticism is almost always a good thing. What I first had to do was determine the speed of Steve flying vertically, which I did by starting at the ground and starting my time at block 7, and then seeing how long it took for him to reach block 256. Since there is a bit of an error for this, my calculated heights will have an error too. However, even with a hefty margin of error for flying speed, the error in height is almost negligible. Once I had the flying speed, I simply held the fly up button for a while and measured that amount of time. Then, height is simply the product of the flying speed times the time spent flying, plus whatever height you start at. By the way, for the 7,153 meter fall, I flew up for 15 minutes and 15 seconds, which provided a thrilling experience looking into the vast emptiness while trying to stop my brain tempting me to let go of the A button halfway through just so I would have to restart. I learned a whole new meaning of the call of the void while up in that endless Minecraft sky, and after staring for so long into that pixelated oblivion, I felt it begin to stare back at me. Anyways, my measurement technique is pretty solid if I do say so myself. What is going on at these lower falls? I can understand why the initial gravity value is so high. I'll go into detail about that in a bit, but basically it helps ground the player to the, well, ground. Considering a Minecraft block is a meter tall, would you like it if it took twice as long to fall off each block every time you walk down a slope? Probably not. Well, realistic gravity would result in that, and it would feel weird. But why the sudden drop in G? My educated guess is that this jerk makes it so the falls from 10 to 30 meters don't feel too fast. You might not notice gravity being 30 plus meters per second squared from less than 5 meters up, but from 30 meters it would feel jarring. Then, the strangest thing of all, the increase in G past 35 meters through to 60 or so, this is likely done to have those more extreme falls not take too long. Of course, a fall from this height is only about 15% faster with a G value of 27.47 versus 21.41, but the increase in G also functions to increase the terminal velocity and the time to reach it. So every fall from great heights gets significantly quicker compared to if G continued decreasing from 20 meters onward. At 255 meters, the time difference is nearly 50% faster for G equals 17.7 versus 8. 8 being a fair extrapolation of G if it did not ever increase. So basically, this weird path lets Minecraft feel slightly better and more responsive to the player without you ever noticing. Here's the same style plot of height versus G value for the Modern Warfare 2019 falls. There aren't as well-defined curves, but there might be some increase in G present in the game. It's just impossible to tell due to the error for each fall. Now, what are the chances that my data for Minecraft are wrong, and there's no increase in G after all? There's definitely that chance, but considering my margins of error, it's about as likely as you, the viewer, being female or subscribed to my channel. But enough about Minecraft and its 1 meter blocky goodness. We need something that is more in tune with our own spatial dimensions. Most people, after all, are not walking over 1 meter obstacles all the time. We need a game with more realism, relatively, of course. We need a game that tells you exactly what gravity is, and if the gravity is not equal to Earth's, it needs to let you manipulate its value. There are 2 candidates I know about, CSGO and Modern Warfare 2. I went with Modern Warfare 2 because I have more experience playing with it, and because it turns out you can adjust the jumping height as well. MW2's default gravity is 800, which is in unit inches, so it is 20.82 meters per second squared. That is a pretty high amount, even compared to CSGO's gravity of 800 hammer units, or 15.24 meters per second squared. How can this huge gravity feel normal? You would think the game would feel odd with nearly Jupiter levels of gravity. Well, let's talk about jump height, which is the yin to gravity's yang. The default jump height is 39, or 0.9906 meters. Well, would you look at that? That is one impressive vertical jump for an average-looking guy carrying a gun. In fact, here's a chart of typical vertical leap heights in the real world. But these aren't comparable because in-game, you are jumping like this, while for these real measurements, you would typically jump like this. So I decided to test how much of an effect holding a gun at the ready has on your vertical jump height, so I could see what kind of master leapers we're dealing with in MW2. Based on my own magnificent jumping abilities, carrying a gun-like object at the ready effectively reduces your vertical leap by about 20%. Of course, that's just for me, so others might be affected differently. But these Call of Duty jumpers must be insane athletes or something. But you have to consider that the in-game vertical leap and the running leap are the same height, which is not how it is in real life. The world record jump height is 2.45 meters, while the highest vertical leap is 1.613 meters. The in-game jump height kind of acts like an average between a running jump and a vertical one. But how does the MW2 jump time compared to the real world? Since getting the time to feel right is probably more important than the height. In the real world, a jump of 0.9906 meters will take 0.899 seconds. Comparing this to the theoretical in-game time of 0.624 seconds, and MW2's jumps are definitely lasting shorter. But that's not a fair comparison. How about comparing a more modest jump in real life, say 50 centimeters, not 99? This 50 number is a bit of a subjective thing, but I picked a value somewhere in the very good range for vertical leaps and multiplied it by 0.8, which is my correction factor for the fact that you are holding a gun. With this new jump height, the real-world value for the time of the jump is 0.639 seconds, which is much closer to the MW2 hang time. Could it be that a high gravitational acceleration is put in place to allow for absurdly high jumps to feel normal? Well, that is certainly one of the reasons why it exists. I played through the game's campaign with the G set to Earth's real value and jump height at 50 centimeters, and I was struggling because certain things you think you should be able to jump over, you just can't anymore. The higher default jump just feels better, but that isn't the only thing that feels better. Playing at Earth's real value for gravity, lots of things feel weird. I should first mention that not everything in the game can be changed by altering gravity. Death animations and NPCs don't seem to be affected, nor the more scripted sequences. What is affected, from what I can tell, is your own gravity, duh, your grenades and equipment, which under realistic gravity have an absurd range now, debris, like from explosions, falling glass, which funnily enough has its own console command associated with it, guns dropped from enemies when they die, and vehicles, both friendly and enemy. Here are some other examples besides grenades of odd stuff going on due to lowered gravity. On the snowmobile Spec Ops race, I was consistently doing 10 to 15 seconds worse than with default gravity. One, because my jumps would shoot me higher into the air and more off course, but oddly enough, I felt like I had less traction. Turning was much more difficult, and my vehicle tended to get flipped onto its side much more often. I literally could not get 3 stars with Earth-like gravity. I also noticed the guns dropped by dying enemies would sometimes fly comically far. Every now and then, I would run over some stairs or some debris or mound on the ground, and would get sent into the air. This did not feel very enjoyable. Stairs in general became more inconsistent to go up and down. But honestly, for most of the time, I didn't even notice the over 50% weaker gravity, except when jumping, which feels way too floaty, with grenades, and with vehicles. In one particular instance, I could not get past a certain area while Earth-like gravity was turned on, because the vehicle always left without me, causing the level to never end. So that's not good. Summarizing my experience playing Call of Duty for the first time with a realistic gravity value, I have to say it was not very fun. And that's kinda weird, because in real life, I wouldn't say the default value for gravity hampers my general gameplay experience much at all. So why does it feel so bad in MW2? And I would also assume most games, since it seems clear that most games use a G value greater than Earth's for similar reasons. One answer is rather obvious and unsatisfying. The games were made with this gravity value in mind, so changing it of course will alter things negatively. But that just raises the question, why were these values chosen in the first place? As I'm not a developer, I can only speculate, but what I think is going on is that little objects dotting the game, small bumps, stairs, things you don't think twice about in real life, these things suck to deal with in video games. You don't want the player to have to think about going up some stairs because that's boring. So you have to smooth them out so the player can just walk up them without a second thought. But if you smooth out everything too much, you lose the feeling of being grounded to the world. So what's an easy way to deal with all this? Just make gravity stronger than in real life so that the player feels like their feet are firmly planted on the ground when they want them to be. and then make jumping much higher to compensate and to allow for easier traversal around obstacles which seem intuitively like they should be able to be jumped over. But even still, with that explanation, why does the insanely high gravity for these games feel normal? For one thing, we've been conditioned to it. There's a good chance you've seen things fall from heights greater than a couple meters in video games more often than you have in real life. And maybe, on the small screen, and with the fast-paced action of video games, higher gravity just looks better. It's sort of like how on film, horses look more like cows than cows do. Also, and this is just a little theory I have with not much evidence, perhaps video games are set at a smaller scale, sort of like miniatures. For example, if a game is set at 1:3 scale, an in-game distance of 10 meters is in the real world 30 meters. When working with falling miniatures, filmmakers will have to film at a higher speed and then slow down the footage. This is done to counteract the fact that gravity doesn't scale down, so objects appear to fall much faster than they should. What all this means for the video games I tested is that for a game to have a gravitational acceleration of, say, 3 times Earth's gravity, or 29.43 meters per second squared, the scale of the miniatures must be 1:3. To find the miniature scale of any game, just take the maximum acceleration due to gravity and divide it by 9.81. That is assuming that the game is going for a realistic-ish feeling gravity, like with the games that I tested. Here are some other games' scales, ignoring the error for G values. Interestingly though, it's not instantly clear whether being at a smaller scale would help explain the high amount of air resistance. If an object's length, width, and height are actually 2 to 3 times shorter, then the mass is 8 to 27 times less. That's just how volume works. And if the object's mass is decreased, it will experience much more air resistance as it falls. However, the air resistance constant is changed as well, and because the object's area is considered 2 times here, both in the cross-sectional area, and as it turns out, the drag coefficient as well, K decreases more than mass decreases. If the object's dimensions are 2 to 3 times shorter, K is 16 to 81 times lower. And with a lower K value, air resistance decreases, but it decreases less so than decreased mass increases air resistance. What ends up happening is these two effects end up basically canceling each other out. The change is basically negligible. It would have been cooler if a smaller scale helped explain the super strong air resistance, but it doesn't, unfortunately. So basically, 45 minutes and 7,150 words later, all I'm trying to say is we've been playing with Hobbit-sized army men this entire time. Video games are a lie. Gravity is a lie. The cake is a lie. Your life is a lie. The universe is a simulation. Vaccines cause adults. Nope, this is not the end of the video. I have some more info to go over which might not be interesting to everyone. It pertains to some corrections for part 1, and measuring if a few games have air resistance or not, and if so, how quickly they reach it. So stick around. I at least find this stuff interesting. First, I got a few requests to measure the gravitational acceleration for space engineers, because gravity plays such an important role in that game that it is even displayed on the HUD. So with some gameplay graciously provided by one of my viewers, since I don't have the game myself, I measured G in 2 different ways, using these 2 kinematic equations. Thankfully, the game shows you your current velocity, which is super helpful. I found G to be equal to about
19.04
meters per second squared, plus or minus a bit. For a game such as this, I would have been surprised at G being such a high value, but after all the testing I've done, I've become desensitized to gas giant strength gravity in games. Moving on. I chose Assassin's Creed 2, Halo 3, Battlefield 3, and Skyrim to go in depth with. The first 3 I chose partially because I did them a bit dirty in part 1. Yes, it's correction time. In Assassin's Creed 2, I failed to realize that in the options menu, there is a section called Stats, which displays the distance covered and height climbed for your playthrough. Why is this in the options menu? I have no idea. That seems like kind of a weird spot, but okay. But using these stats, I remeasured the two campaniles' heights. Giotto's came out to 64 meters, which is quite close to what I got in part 1, so that's good. But I was feeling nervous about St. Mark's because it has this spire thing that goes inwards. I tried compensating for it in part 1, but evidently I didn't do that great of a job because the stats show that the height is 54 meters, which is quite a ways off from my previous value. So that kinda stinks. Here are the new and improved values for G. But getting back to terminal velocity, I measured if it was a thing or not by looking back at footage of me falling here and lining up my position on the building like this. I tried to get the best perspective of the campanile by being positioned far away and using a basic 3D effect, which made all the angles 90 degrees, which is what we want. Each of these lines that I placed are the locations the top of my head was at every 8 frames. As you can see, near the bottom, the lines are about the same width apart. That means my velocity is constant, which therefore means there is terminal velocity, and you reach it in about 1.75 to 2 seconds, which is incredibly fast. Now, moving on to Halo 3, I thought there would be terminal velocity because that's just what it feels like when you're playing for whatever reason. But first, in part 1, I said I believed there was no way to measure distance in the game. I was wrong. The sniper rifle, when scoped in, gives a distance and elevation reading whenever looking at a friendly or an enemy. I used the elevation value to see my own height, since the elevation is actually just the difference in elevation between you and your target. Using this, I logged my change in height for one section of a 51.93 meter fall, and my change in height for another section a bit further down in the fall. Oh, and if you're thinking, hey, doesn't the Valhalla map take place on the Ark, not Earth? Well, yes, that's true, but come on, it's not like Bungie would have actually changed the value of gravity depending on the location of the multiplayer map. That would be silly, or kind of awesome, actually. Well, for the higher section of the fall, I started at frame 23 from the start and went to frame 44, covering 2.45 meters in that time. For the lower section, I started measuring at frame 124 through to frame 144. I can compare the distance traveled during these times to a theoretical distance traveled, assuming no air resistance. To find this theoretical value, I used the G value I got from the entire fall, G equals 12.787 meters per second squared, to find the velocity at the start of each section of the fall using this rearranged kinematic equation. I then used this velocity value as my initial velocity for this other kinematic equation to find the expected distance assuming a constant G. For the upper section, my expected distance was 2.62 meters traveled, compared to 2.45 meters for the experimental value. For the lower section, the expected distance was 9.39 meters, and the experimental was 10.38 meters. The margin of error for the expected distance factors in the error for the G value and the error for the initial velocity, so the expected distance error is quite large and envelops the experimental values. That means constant gravitational acceleration is a good match for this fall. So in Halo 3, there likely is no terminal velocity, or it is reached very slowly compared to other games. Now with Battlefield 3, there aren't any corrections, it's just that I only brought up a single fall in part 1, which was kind of a snub, considering how easy it is to test fall heights in the game. Here are 5 more falls. The lowest fall was off a shipping container, and that is the standard height for those. As you can see, gravity doesn't change much from a short fall to a really high one. This led me to think that there's no air resistance or terminal velocity in the game, which was more surprising to me than almost anything else I tested in this video. I always thought of terminal velocity existing in more realistic games like this, but maybe I was wrong. To make sure, I did a similar, though simpler, test as I did with Halo 3. This time, I fell from 923 meters, and after 7.133 seconds, which should be enough time for air resistance to be noticeable, if it exists, I measured the distance covered during 3 25-frame sections. I used the distance markers on the objective I was falling over, and also added in a bit of height correction using the Pythagorean theorem, because I was not perfectly oriented right above the objective marker. For the upper section of the fall, I traveled 59 meters in 25 frames. For the middle section, 66 meters. And for the lower section, 71 meters. If I had reached terminal velocity by then, all these numbers should be the same because my velocity would be constant. But they are not the same, not even close. So, Battlefield 3 does not have terminal velocity, at least from falls from over 900 meters. Wow, you learn something cool every day. And finally, Skyrim. I would have tested Fallout 3 instead, but I don't have that on PC, and I am less familiar with how I could have accomplished finding terminal velocity in the game. But the downside for using Skyrim is that it's not set on Earth. Oh well. There's a mod which lets you see your current height, but you can also measure height using the amount of fall damage you receive. But this second method doesn't work under 600 in-game units, which are equal to 0.0142875 meters. The mod was therefore a more robust tool, and I made sure its height value matched the fall damage value. It did. Here are all the falls I ran, ranging from 1.0189 meters to 6,227.59 meters. As you can see, the gravitational acceleration seems constant, i.e. no terminal velocity. That's kind of interesting. But what's a bit odd is how much lower the short fall G values were compared to the high fall average, even when considering margin of error. An explanation for this is that my testing method was off, but I think a potentially better explanation is that your fall speed decreases right as you are about to hit the ground, in which case only the falls from lower down would have their G values affected by very much. There isn't much empirical evidence in Skyrim I can get to confirm this, but perhaps another game has a similar kind of thing which would help bolster, but not confirm, my conjecture. It turns out in Portal, your velocity goes down quite a bit when you are about to hit the ground after falling. Here's a graph of the change in velocity between each frame for a fall from quite a ways up. The velocity does not go from being a high value to being 0 in a single frame. It actually takes 4 frames for it to fully reach 0. Here's another plot which shows a similar thing, the change in position from one frame to the next. Since the game's frame rate was capped at 90, and the game capture was done at 60 frames per second, there's this odd stutter step thing going on. I did this so I could get 2 trend lines using half the data points, just to confirm that the change in position is increasing over time, which is what we expect with acceleration. What's kind of funny is that it takes 6 more frames once velocity reaches 0 for position to settle to ground level. So position is changing, but velocity is 0. Huh. Does any of this translate over to Skyrim and its potential jump slowdown? It's hard to say. But at least there is precedent for the slowdown of a landing for a jump occurring across multiple frames. For all the games I tested, all 18 of them, I think the most important things to take away are 1. Each game has its own gravitational acceleration value, which is tailored to make the game feel as good as possible and is almost always higher than in real life. And 2. Each game must decide whether to implement some form of air resistance or terminal velocity. This has a surprising impact on the measurement of gravity in the game, because usually the terminal velocity is achieved much quicker than in real life. Why do some games have a terminal velocity and some do not? I honestly don't see much of a pattern across these games. Implementing it is likely more challenging than not, but perhaps it makes falls from higher up feel better for the player. It's a trade-off. All this talk of realism shouldn't lead you to believe that a realistic G value is better. My time spent playing MW2 should show you that whatever G value feels best and allows for the most natural feeling traversal in the game world is the G value that should be used, regardless of what Earth says realistic gravity should be. And as always, thanks for watching.
Are you still there?
Good job making it through that whole thing. Hopefully you found my explanations helpful or at least a little interesting. Part 2 was originally very different from this. I ended up fixing and adding in a bunch of stuff. So if you want to hear what this video originally would have been, I decided to provide my original recording of Part 2 here. It's a bit rough and there's some misinformation and it lacks a lot of info present in this video, so I'm glad I decided to split it up into parts 1 and 2 and was able to do some revisions on Part 2. Go have a look if for some reason you want to compare the two, or maybe see what took me so long to make this current Part 2. Okay, bye-bye. Bye-bye.